What's up guys, it's Blue TTHD back with another Vanguard deck profile. This time it's going to be for Shadow Paladin in Premium, post Clan Collection Vol.6 and post Clan Collection 2022. Now apologies again for the repeat of our shaky cam variant of these deck profiles, but please bear with me once again for this video as I continue to be in the process of moving. So yeah, with this deck profile today, we're going to talk about Morfessa Turbo variant. Yes, we're taking a trip back to 2019/early 2020 with the new tools that Shadow Paladin had received in those kinds of sets, especially with the introduction of Morfessa to the premium format. We are going to be making use of cards such as Cherishing Knight Rimmon, as well as the new one from Clan Collection Vol.6, Origin Mage Illdona, in order to bring back this this wretched Shadow Paladin strategy that had plagued Luard for a good number of years. So yeah, before we get into the deck profile, I do want to point out that if you haven't already watched my Luard deck profile from around April or so of this year, please do so. The link for that will be in the description. That's where I kind of go over the more control variant of Luard that I personally have a preference for. But also make sure to keep in mind for this build, it's going to be a lot different. We're going to be a lot more fast-paced to kind of match the level of aggression that we're going to be seeing a lot this upcoming format. And with that in mind, we're going to be most of the time picking Force 2 as our imaginary gift of choice for whenever we ride into Illdona, which we'll go over a little later. But yeah, I just wanted to get that out of the way before we get into the deck, so now let's go right in. So as you can see, our starter has not changed one bit. We are still running Dragprince Rute as our starter of choice. The V-Series starter, of course, allows us to draw a card when rode upon, as well as get a quick shield if our opponent's already on grade 1 or greater. So this is still important because we need to have that extra card in soul right away, and the extra card draw really helps out early game when we're kind of at our weakest in terms of card economy for this build. So having that as well as the extra quick shield in hand to potentially defend against our opponent's rush really helps out for a build like this. Of course, next up we are running still 4 copies of Astral Chain Dragon, the Heal Guardian for Shadow Paladin. This of course should not change for pretty much any premium build. Heal Guardians are the way to go in the premium format currently. You really need them to survive your opponent's early game pressure, as well as the fact that the 15k shield isn't that huge of a deal because we're going to be discarding them late game anyway for G Guardians. So the Heal Guardian continues to remain very important. This is especially the case for this build because of Illdona, and because of the fact that Heal Guardians are grade 3. This card actually becomes searchable off of Illdona's skill, which very important actually, especially if our opponent decides to damage deny us going into our grade 3 turn, because it allows us to do our plays, which gets us the card draw from Illdona, for example, or we can start getting the milling from Rimmon off. So it basically becomes very important to have that counterblast available if our opponent decides to damage deny us. And also the fact that, of course, you give your Vanguard +10 or -2 crits to your opponent's unit really helps out for, again, surviving that early game. So very important to run the Heal Guardian still in this deck. I don't think there's any reason to run any 20k shield heal triggers or any other heal triggers available. Next up, we're running 4 copies of Gillingr. This is the Stride Fodder crit. We're still running this because the ability to discard this card as cost for Stride, in lieu of a potential Luard skill to strike for free, still turns out to be very useful because we want that flexibility just in case we don't have enough grade 1s in the drop zone and early on, as well as the fact that this is a trigger. So keep in mind that this counts as a grade 1 for the purposes of our Morfessa, which Morfessa is pretty much going to be the only stride we go into in the ideal game state for most of the time. So we're still running the Stride Fodder crit, and the fact that, of course, it's 15k shield and a 10k power boost, very important still for defensive triggers and for defense in general. Alright, next up for the stand triggers. So you can't run a Morfessa-based Luard build without running a couple of these stand triggers. And honestly, Shadow Paladin has some very strong stand triggers available to them. So we're going to be making use of all of these in our deck build. So here, as you can see, we're running 6 stands in total, 4 of them being Curse-Eyed Raven, and 2 of them being Mage of the Rogue Eye, Arsur. So I haven't talked about Arsur that much on this channel, so we'll go over him in more detail. I feel like you guys are probably already familiar with how powerful Curse-Eyed Raven is already, but Arsur is one that we can use early on as one of our retire fodder in lieu of a potential card that we would not want to call, just because it goes back to the deck when it's retired as ability, or when it's retired for the cost or ability of or cost or effect of your ability. Sorry, it's a really complicated way of saying basically if it gets retired for one of your skills, then it goes back to the deck. But at GB1, we have an extra thing that allows for Arsur to count as 2 rear guards when it's retired as the cost for one of those abilities. So that means if we retire it for Morfessa, for example, we can just retire this as a sole card for fulfilling the Morfessa cost. This also works for something like Illdona, which requires 2 rear guards to retire, as well as Dagda. Even though Dagda only requires 1 card to be retired, this is a viable candidate because it is a grade 1 or lower. So this card is actually very strong in any Luard based deck, but especially in this deck because we do have a lot of cards that require us to retire as cost, and because we want stands to complement the fast, Morfessa based strategy, this card works really well for that. But we're not running a full 4 copies of it because it is kind of a brick, the more copies you run of it, especially since it's also a 5k trigger instead of a 10k. So you don't want to have too many of these in your deck, but I felt like 2 is a good number for it. And then of course 4 copies of Cursed Raven. This card still remains one of the best effect triggers that Shadow Paladin has, and this allows you to effectively make 2 bodies of retire fodder on place, which allows your on place abilities to also activate, such as Charon, and Charon is the ultimate roll off of this card. It just allows you to feel sick about yourself when you get Charon off of Cursed Raven. But Cursed Raven's still very important to get stand triggers back in the deck, especially when we've thinned our deck a lot by the time we go into our second Morfessa if necessary. But the first Morfessa that we do in our first stride, usually this card will show up quite a bit, even in that state of the game, because again, we're running the 4 copies. Alright, and for the last of our grade 0s, we've got 1 copy of Dragwizard Vicreau. This is still a remnant of our older Luard build. This card is still very important to use as our resource engine because it fulfills 2 roles as 1 card. It fulfills your soul resource engine role, as well as your countercharge engine role. So very good card, and also has ritual, which works well with Dragfall Luard as well as Dragabyss Luard in our G zone. And then we've got 1 copy of the Olbaria, the generic overtrigger. This card is still better as the overtrigger of choice in any Morfessa based Luard build, just because the double 100 million works very well with our stand triggers as well as with our guard restrict that's online with Morfessa. Just because we're able to apply it to 2 rear guards. That's the most important part about it. Keter Sanctuary Overtrigger is not as useful, but it can still be run. There's no issue with that. And then finally, we got 1 copy of Prorobi. This is supposed to be the overdressed draw trigger. I still don't have it, by the way, so bear with me on having Dragwizard Bab as the replacement. But yes, Prorobi is indeed the card to run over Dragwizard Bab. One of the users commented on that in, I think, the previous Luard deck profile. So yeah, that's pretty much all there is about the trigger lineup. I do want to mention briefly why we're running 1 copy of a draw trigger as opposed to something like Bellow Owl. I do like the draw just because it gives us something as like discard fodder just mentally that like gives us a little bit more comfort, as well as the fact that it's 10k defensive and it gives you a +1 to hand. So still really useful for the general purpose of our deck, which is to kind of survive early game and then go into Morfessa first stride and hopefully kill them. And having this draw trigger can really help with cycling through the deck as well, because we want that deck to be as thin as possible. That's going to do it for the trigger lineup. Let's go into the grade 1s, of which we're running a total of 18 grade 1s, so this is kind of more familiar with for you guys that are used to old school Luard builds that had a bunch of grade 1s and not much else in there. So we're going to start off with 4 copies of Karma Collector. Karma Collector is the go-to PG just because I like having countercharge PGs for Luard builds. I think resource management turns out to be something very difficult. Even with all the cards that we're able to go into, you still need some extra countercharge just to give us some comfort, as well as the fact that we're not really trying to recover PGs as what Ezra's does. The problem with Ezra's is that it just doesn't activate enough times per game in order to warrant running it over Karma Collector, whereas Karma Collector, because we have so many cards to mill this into the drop zone early on, we're probably going to be getting this off 1 to 2 times per game, which is plenty. That is all we need. I mean, getting 2 counter charges off of a card like this, which is pretty much like bonus counter charges to help you out with going into more of your counterblast plays, such as Liafail or Rimmon or anything in our G zone that has counterblast as well, really helps for how this deck can speed through and killing off the opponent, as well as of course defensive measures that were added to our G zones, such as Deep Griever Dragon, which is the new G-Guardian PG that Shadow Paladin got in Clan Collection 2022. So Karma Collector, once again, very good card, even as a ride target, especially because we're comfortable riding this since we can Soul Blast it to the drop zone very easily off of our Liafail card played on our grade 2 turn. This will be in the drop zone right away, so that you can basically right away get the counter charges. And the fact that it's 6k, so it allows you to inherently damage deny against most clans, because a lot of people will be riding into like a grade 1 with 8k or 7k, but this card is 6k, so it allows you to swing under and still get that drive check to get the +1 to your hand. So very valuable card still, in my opinion. Alright, next up, 4 copies of Cherishing Knight Branwen. Still the go-to beat stick for this deck, because not only is it a grade 3 searcher, but it also has a very easy condition to fulfill for the extra 5k, which is having 3 or more grade 1s in your drop zone. During our Morfessa turn, grade 0s also count as grade 1s. So because of that, we're able to get this card even more easily off on our first stride. But because it is an easy 28k beat stick on our Morfessa turn, this is our go-to for those purposes. It's also a pretty good ride target because it allows us to search our Luards, which we're not running there that many. So keep in mind, very important to have max copies of this card because it allows you to get those grade 3s a lot more effectively. And keep in mind, Heal Garden is also grade 3s, so you can search out a Heal Garden with this card as well, if ever necessary. But also keep in mind, remember, this is only one place from hand, it's not one place from anywhere. So you won't be getting this card's effect off of something like Liafail or any of the stride bonus cards. So you do have to have this in your hand, which is why, again, 4 copies is good because it's more likely to see it in your hand the more copies of what we're running in the deck. Alright, next up is 4 copies of Black Sage Charon. And I'm about to eat my own words in this one because I do remember saying in the previous Luard deck profile that 4 copies of Charon was not necessary. I know, guys, I know. I kind of changed my mind for the purposes of this build. For this build, 4 Charon is absolutely necessary in my opinion because we do need as many counter charges as possible early on, just so that we get the more buys in the field for free off of Liafail and our stride bonus, as well as being able to more easily manage our resources. Because basically, when I had 3, there was always situations where one ended up in the damage zone or one ended up in the hand where, it's not as useful in the hand, right? But I was like, I wish I had one more in the deck. And I added the 4th one, and I was like, wow, actually, this feels really good. And the fact that you're able to recover more as well because you're running more means that you'll be able to use it more often, especially when you recover them off the stride bonus or off of Deep Griever. So having the extra grade 1 spot being Charon, that was very useful. Now, of course, you can still run this at 3 if you'd like, but I do like the 4 copies of Charon for me personally, especially since we're always doing Liafail into Charon pretty much all the time, unless the opponent gives us 2 damage going into grade 2, in which case you'd probably do Liafail into Charon, then Liafail into Rimmon. Depends on your personal preference, though. I don't think Rimmon is 100% necessary to do that early. It depends on kind of the state of the game as well as the matchup you're facing, how early you need to go into Rimmon. But we'll get to Rimmon later. Just wanted to mention that 4 copies of Charon is still amazing, and having this to go off of Dragheart Luard means that you're going to have 2 counter charges, which is a net +1 in counter charge, as well as 2 grade 1 buys to retire for anything that you might need them, which of course adds on to your ritual as well. So Charon, very good. Now, unfortunately, because we're running 4 copies of this means we're more likely going to see it in opening hands, and it's not a very good ride target, to be honest. But that's just the way it goes. I was willing to sacrifice that over not having enough Charon, because 1 went into damage zone or too many went into the hand, and not having enough things to recycle it with, because the cards that recycle with it require me to call them right back out anyway when I prefer to get some other cards occasionally, such as Vicreau, off of such cards. So basically, I was kind of in a wrap and needed to add another Charon to give me more comfort mentally, and I feel very comfortable with this. Alright, I've talked so much about Rimmon, and you're probably wondering, what's Rimmon? Yeah, this is Rimmon, guys. This is the promo from about 2020 or so that I haven't really seen many people run. And it's actually such a great promo for this exact build, a Morfessa Turbo build. This card reads, on an activated ability from Rearguard Circle, we counter S1 and retire itself, and then check the top 5 cards of our deck and mill any number of grade 1s that we find. And the rest go back to the deck and shuffle, and then our Vanguard gets +10. Like, already looking at the top 5 and milling selectively the grade 1s that you'd like to the drop zone is good on its own for the cost even, and the fact that it retires itself, which means it adds to the ritual by itself. But then the +10 is like just the icing on the cake. This allows our Morfessa to swing to like 51 without too much effort, because, you know, if we're not boosting a Morfessa on our Morfessa turn, it's already going to be at 41, which is the 26 plus the 15 that we get from Morfessa skill. It's going to be at 51, which means your opponent has to respect it a lot more. Of course, they're probably already dropping a PG, so it's not going to change things that much in that front. But regardless, if the opponent was thinking about guard with anything other than a PG, then this would probably force them to throw down that PG earlier than they might even want to. And the fact that you can also go into this card on your going first grade 3 turn, let's say you wrote into Illdona or some other card, if you go into this on your Illdona turn when Illdona is your Vanguard, this means that Illdona will more likely have a higher power boost because if you mill enough grade 1s off of this card on that turn. And remember, Illdona is also getting plus 10 because of this card already, so Illdona can get up to like 38k power or 48k power on that first turn. And because I mentioned earlier we're running Force 2, that means your opponent's already going to have to somewhat respect your going first grade 3 turn, which is not a typical characteristic of Luard. Already the opponent was like not really respecting Luard's going first grade 3 turn, because of course Luard doesn't really do that much if you're running the stride bonus versions. But now with Illdona as our Vanguard and with Force 2 as well, we go into this card, give Illdona plus 10, as well as get extra grade 1s for Illdona to get extremely high power, like 48k or 38k or 48k, even 58k is possible as well, depending on the number of grade 1s that are dropped. But that combined with Force 2 and the draw 2 off of Illdona is just flat out incredible. And keep in mind that we can always search this card whenever we like, because it is a grade 1. Despite being 8k, it still allows to be called off of the stride bonus or off of Dragabyss or any other card that can call this card. Now the Cannabis 1 cost is a little bit heavy, probably at first look, which is why we were running, part of why we were running extra Charon in the deck, and why I'm still running Karma Collector as well as the countercharge PG. But I really like this card in this deck, and I'm surprised not a lot of people are on this card. So really good for any turbo based or any Morfessa turbo based Luard build. I think this card is especially good over Blue Spotted Dragon, because Blue Spotted Dragon oftentimes can just screw you over in terms of what it mills, because it is not a selective mill, whereas this card is 100% selective. And oftentimes actually I don't find myself needing this card 100% to get the 10 grade 1s and drop on the first stride. Bronick can also fulfill this as well depending on the game state. But because we are running 18 grade 1s, Bronick is very likely to see these kinds of grade 1s off of its mill as well. So it just really helps out with getting everything going very fast, very quickly. So I really love this card, and I'm surprised, again, not many people are on it, but it's terrific for this build. Alright, to finish things in the grade 1 lineup, we've got 1 copy of Honoly and 2 copies of Knies. So this has not changed from the previous Luard build that I had showed on this channel. Honoly, of course, just being a necessary thing to run in this meta. I think a lot of decks are just so fast in terms of what they can accomplish on that first stride, or even first grade 3 turn, in fact. Honoly doesn't really do much on against the first grade 3 turn, but against a stride turn, especially with the likes of Spike Brothers or Aquaforce, or even Murakuma with what they've got going nowadays, Honoly can be very useful if they don't have any removal against it. And oftentimes, even if they do have removal, this is just something that they have to focus on before they continue to finish you off, which means that other eminent threats on your board can remain safe. So very important psychological factor there. But typically you cannot rely on solely Honoly. You do need to have a sufficient hand size, which is why we need the early game card draw with things such as Illdona and that 1 draw trigger we're running as well. So Honoly enough is probably not going to save you, but it's good to run in this deck to call it out early on, just in case you know that your opponent's going to give you a very hard time on their first stride. And then we've got 2 copies of Knies. This is mainly to search out our Dragheart Luard or our Liafail. Those cards are still being run in this deck, so we do need a way of searching them out on a good grade 1 ride. But I'm running only 2 copies of this because at 4 copies it's not as good. It's basically just our best grade 1 ride target, but it's not like we need 4 copies because that second ability is not worth running the 4 copies, but it is a pretty solid ability still. When it's placed by card ability, Soul Blast 1, and our opponent chooses a card to retire, or chooses a rear guard to retire. But still very useful, especially if we need some extra cards to control our opponent's board, just in case we ever go into Cruach. But usually you're not going into Cruach anyway. But this card works really well with Cruach because it forces your opponent's rear guard count to go down by 1, and usually oftentimes that's enough to let Cruach's good skill go online, which allows you to restand it and get it +10 for the rest of the turn. So Knies still very good, but again, mostly as our first grade 1 ride target, not really as not really for its like second ability, but just overall it's a very solid card to see in your opening hand, and you should keep it pretty much all the time because it allows you to search the cards that we are running in this deck a lot more easily. So again, really loving Knies, and we're still keeping it in. So now onto the grade 2s. This is probably the most interesting part of this build, because I feel like the grade 2 lineup kind of highlights how deck building is going to start changing going forward ever since Illdona was released. So here we've got 4 copies of Liafail, and we're going to see here that we're actually running only 7 grade 2s. And again, Illdona is part of the reason for that, but also the other reason is that we are running Knies, so Knies can also search Liafail, and that way we're still able to get to our smooth ride line without missing one of our rides. So Liafail is still the best grade 2 that we can have early game, not only for the 10k base, but also the fact that it can search out any of the grade 1s that you need, usually being Charon or Rimmon. Sometimes it can be sometimes it can be Knies, sometimes it could be other things, but most of the time it's either Rimmon, Knies, or Charon. Charon is the go-to because it gives us a free body that we can use later for retire fodder. And keeping that counterblast is the most important part of that play, because we're able to use that counterblast for plays later, such as our stride bonus or even our G Guardian PG, as well as our standard plays involving Morfessa and such. So Liafail into Charon is still our go-to, despite not having something like Knee Main in this deck, which you'll see pretty soon here that we're not running grade 2 Knee Main anymore. In fact, we're not running any Knee Mains anymore. Might be to your surprise, but it's not really needed anymore for this kind of deck. So the last of our grade 2s are 3 copies of Dagda. So this remains like one of the staples you have to run for any Morfessa-based Luard build. And the reason for this is your main finisher. This is what allows you to pop off going into your first stride, second stride, and onward, because it's active on GB1 and Ritual 5. But because it doesn't do anything early game, we don't want to run 4 copies of it. Probably some of you are wondering why I'm not running 4 copies, because this is a very fast-paced Morfessa build, right? Like, we need to see this card as soon as we go into that stride. But I haven't had trouble with finding this card early, especially with Illdona now. We're able to search this card out if we haven't seen it early game, and then just hold on to it until it's needed. And also the fact that we have so much deck thinning, so much drawing, allows us to see this a lot more easily. I'm content with it at 3 copies, but feel free to run 4 copies if that's what you're more comfortable with. Just keep in mind that this card's kind of dead early game. It doesn't really do much, and that sometimes, yeah, you do have to write it, but a lot of times we end up finding that second copy anyway to go into, which allows us to go into our best plays with Morfessa and such. Now, also keep in mind that this is susceptible to Denial Griffin, and honestly, there's not too much that we can do about that, but keep in mind that such a matchup is probably going to be a little unfavorable for you anyway, just because that's how Luard works. Any Luard deck that you play is going to be susceptible to some form of Denial Griffin. You just got to have the resources prepared if you see that's a matchup that can potentially come up in. But also, just for the fact that this card can call out the plethora of grade 1s that we're running in this deck, we're not too concerned. If you want to, you can always force your opponent to shotgun the Denial Griffin play that they have, just so that we can still go into the rest of our plays, because this activates on attack. So we're still able to get it off into something like Charon or Branwen during our first stride or second stride and onward. That's all for the grade 2s, surprisingly. Now, the grade 2 lineup, as I told you, was very small, very slim. And again, I think this is going to be the advent of greedy deck building, thanks to Illdona, because Illdona allows us to basically search any grade 2 or greater in our deck as long as we find it in our opening hand after our grade 1 ride. And speaking of which, we're going to talk about the grade 3s here going into this. All right, so now we're going to the grade 3s. This should really be a part of the grade 1 lineup, because I failed to mention up to this point that Illdona counts as a grade 1 for all intents and purposes while it's in the deck or drop zone. So this kind of ups our grade 1 count to 22 instead of 18. But basically this is a grade 1 and a grade 3 in the best possible ways. So we're running 4 copies of Illdona. As you can see, I have 3 of them face down. No worries, these are just proxies for the moment. But Illdona serves a multitude of purposes that I think will be very evident to become a problem later on as we start to see the meta kind of develop even more. This is especially a problem card in the V-based Luard build in Premium that utilizes the V pieces that Luard has along with Nightmare Painter to get a very oppressive first grade 3 turn, and then from there on just aggro out the opponent with a bunch of crits and such. But Illdona serves as not only your greedy searcher, which allows you to turn your deck building around in a manner that has not probably been seen in quite a while in the history of Vanguard, but also the fact that on the Vanguard or Rearguard circle, when you attack with it, you can counterblast 1 and retire 2 of your rear guards and draw 2 for free. And then on the Vanguard circle, it gets an extra 5k for each grade 1 in your drop zone. So this allows you to get a real grade 3 turn for once. This is not something that Luard has ever had, a real grade 3 turn. So this is very impressive and very important for us to leverage in any Shadow Paladin build from here on out. And just the fact that it's a grade 1 in deck means that you can call this off of Liafail as well if you ever need to, which means that you can get a 13k beater that early. And this is also a card we'll be going into off of Dagda. Sometimes when you don't want to go into Branwen or Charon, you go into this card, which allows you to get, again, that 13k beater, which turns into 28 on your Morfessa turn, but also allows you to draw in the middle of your Morfessa turn just in case you feel like your opponent's going to survive the Morfessa turn, the first Morfessa turn, that is. So this card is just insane. It just does so much, and it's going to be doing so much. It's going to be putting so much work for every single Shadow Paladin deck from here on out. And honestly, I feel like this card is a little too strong. I'm not saying it should be hit in the next ban list, but I'm saying later on we could probably see it being hit in some form down the line. But again, we'll see. I do think it should serve its time for now in the format. Of course, let the damage be done and let it be seen whether it's deserved to be hit later on. And that's kind of the philosophy I have for hits and bans. But all that aside, love this card, and of course we got to use it in any Shadow Paladin build, and this Morfessa Turbo build is no exception. Alright, and now on to the last cards of our main deck. We've got 1 copy of Dragheart Luard and 2 copies of Dragfall Luard. Both of these are the G variants of the card. Now, the reason why we're running a 1-2 split and not a 1-3 split, or not even a 1-4 split, is that, again, as I mentioned in the other Luard deck profile, this card is searchable by a plethora of means, so we're comfortable just running the 1 copy. But honestly, it is the card that you prefer to have online, just because it's able to call 2 off its Stride bonus. However, the problem with this card tends to be that you don't always have a card on your field to retire going into your Stride turn. And also, this card happens to be very good when you go first and you ride into it on your grade 3 turn. But if you go second, then you're not able to actually use its first skill because it has to trigger at the beginning of the ride phase. And at that time, it's not the current Vanguard. So you miss out on being able to stride for free if you go into this card going second as your first grade 3 ride. So that's why we're running only 1 copy of it. Those are all the kind of reasons that we're running only 1 copy of it. But it's still kind of our better one to go into if everything goes perfectly for it. But we're still running the 2 copy of the Dragfall for the reasons that I mentioned, that Dragheart Luard is only being run at 1 copy. This card is not searchable in as many ways as Dragheart Luard is, but because of Illdona, we're able to still search this card relatively easily. And of course, Branwen is still a bit searcher as well. So again, it allows for more greedy deck building and allows us to cut down on the number of copies needed, since we're not really, we don't actually need 4 copies of it, since we're not discarding anything for stride costs most of the time. We're just striding for free pretty much every turn. So the reason why, there might be some reasons that you have personally that you'd run more copies of Dragheart Luard or more copies of Dragfall Luard, or just more copies of both of them cumulatively. One, you might be finding that you're not hitting the right of these 2 Luards when you want to, so maybe you want to up the one that you want to see more often. Or 2, maybe you're feeling like, I don't need to run both of these as a flex option. I can just run 3 of the Dragheart Luard or 3 of the Dragfall Luard. And you know what? You'd be totally fine in doing that, I think. For me personally, this is just my preference. Having having at least 1 of each of these has been my preference for a long time. And the searchability of both of these just adds to like how I decide to put these in this deck, and especially with the introduction of Illdona, I feel like this can be worked with. But absolutely, if you'd like to run more of either one of these, then go for it. I do feel like Dragfall Luard still remains to be the better one of the 2, just because it doesn't require any rear guards on your board in order to go into its stride bonus. And also you're able to get a retire off of it, which adds to the more control factor if it's necessary for you to switch to that based on the matchup. But again, both of these are great cards in their own right, and they fulfill a very unique purpose that I still think remains to be unmatched by any other deck in this format. That's going to do it for the main deck, guys. Let's go ahead and see what's going on in the G-Zone now. So the G-Zone, to start it off, we got 4 copies of Dragabyss Luard. The G-Zone is largely unchanged from the previous deck profile, just because the G-Zone for Shadow Paladins was pretty much airtight already, and there are very few changes that are actually necessary to make it the best possible thing it could be. Dragabyss Luard is still a card that's necessary to have available to go into, just because sometimes you won't have that Morfessa online. Not to mention it's actually still a terrific card because it allows you to go effectively +1 without using a counterblast, and it allows you to net counter charge if that's what you need. So because of that, and the fact that you can also retire if you call 2 ritual abilities, which can never happen for this deck, but you can also run Fuamnok in the main deck if you would like to. But the fact that also on a GB3 it gets your front row +10 for every 4 grade 1s in your drop zone, and keep in mind we were running a total of, for all intents and purposes, 22 grade 1s in our deck. So this card can still function as a Morfessa mini if you need a card to go into and you don't have any counterblast available. But again, this card is just mainly for that and not much else. Since we are a turbo build, we usually want to just go into Morfessa most of the time, but this card still fulfills a great purpose in this G-Zone. Alright, next up, 3 copies of Morfessa herself. I need not explain this card necessarily. We're pretty much, this is our main goal for the entire deck. And you know, as far as Luard goes, this is the main card you want to go into just for all Luard builds, but this build is certainly with the one that we want to go into this card pretty much all the time. We'll have this online usually on first stride if everything goes well, either, you know, by means of Bronuk in our G-Guardian lineup, or by means of Rimmon, or, you know, just by ordinary Liafail Karin plays. Basically our normal flow of our turns oftentimes gets a lot of grade 1s in the drop zone, especially thanks to the new card in Illdona. So once again, you want to have this card available to go into on your first stride and onward, and plus the fact that Rimmon can give this +10 on the Morfessa turn allows for your Vanguard attack to be a lot more threatening and will usually warrant a PG from the opponent. But yeah, again, not much else to say on this card. I feel like I've explained it to its full that it needs to be explained in the previous deck profile, so feel free to check that out if you like additional insight on what this card does for this deck. But last thing I do want to point out is that you can use Arsur to fulfill the full retire cost for this card, as I mentioned earlier, as well as Vicreau, of course, which is just our standard stride bonus play. But yeah, otherwise, again, not much else to say about Morfessa. Alright, next up, we've got 2 copies of the new one from Clan Collection 2022, Cruach. Now, this is in the G-Zone mainly as a fallback, just in case we need something that's impactful on our first stride when Morfessa is not available. But sometimes Dragabyss is more useful in that regard, just because Dragabyss does not require any counterblast at all. But Dragabyss' issue is that the GB3 is sometimes hard to get online on your first stride, so if you're not able to get that sometimes, then it's not worth it. But again, if you're damage denied or if you don't have enough counterblast, then Dragabyss is kind of the better option over Cruach. However, Cruach is just a phenomenal card in the other Luard build, the more mid-range tempo control Luard build that I presented in the previous deck profile, just because this allows you to go insanely plus on your first stride and still put on a lot of pressure on your opponent. And those costs to retire can really help for setting up for Morfessa in the following turn. Of course, because you're retiring 2 rear guards for the first part of the skill, and then you're retiring 2 rear guards again if you get the red part of the skill, which allows you to, if your opponent cannot retire 3 rear guards by the effect, then it gets the following skill, which allows you to get +10 to the Vanguard and counterblast 1 after it attacks. Then you restand it, and it does not lose any drive, which is the most important part, which means you'll be cycling through your deck a lot more quickly, and you'll also probably hit your triggers more likely, which means that means also more Cursed Ravens to have in hand for the Morfessa turn. But again, this card is mostly flip fodder. You don't really want to be going into this on your first stride, because Morfessa is what enables the deck to be fast and on par with the rest of the decks in this format. But again, Cruach's still a great card in Luard, in my opinion, and we're going to make use of it when the situation does come up. And finally, rounding off the lineup of strides, we've got 2 copies of Dark Dragon Phantom Blaster Diablo. This card is still a solid card from the old G Zone. It's a remnant of kind of old school Luard. This is actually one of the better strides that Luard's had throughout G era in general. It gives you an unguardable attack if your opponent does not fulfill the condition of being able to retire rear guards in the red text. And so that makes it a solid finisher. But your opponent can still guard from the G Zone, mind you. They can still guard by any other method that's not from the hand. But generally speaking, this is enough to seal the deal against them if you've got everything lined up properly and you've expended the resources sufficiently in previous turns, such as the Morfessa turn or the Dragabyss turn, if that's applicable. Now, keep in mind, this is probably a flip fodder card once again, but honestly, you never need to flip this because we do have Cruach available for that. This card is still useful to have in the back of your D-Zone, just in case that situation does come up as aforementioned. And this is kind of, again, a remnant of the old G Luard builds, but it's still a solid card, so which is why it's still slotted in this list. Alright, finally to round off the G Zone, we've got the G Guardian lineup. 2 Deepgriever, 1 Gillingr, 1 Plotmaker, and 1 Bronek. Now notice how I'm not running 2 Plotmaker. I actually feel like Plotmaker is still a good card, but honestly Bronek is just so good in this deck that you're oftentimes going into it on your first G Guard anyway, just to get those grade 1s in the drop, because we are again running a total of 22. And keep in mind that yes, Illdona does count as a grade 1 in the context of Bronek because you're revealing from your deck in the revealed zone. The cards that are in the revealed zone from the deck are still considered the deck. And since Illdona is a grade 1 in the deck, it's still going to count as a grade 1, which means you do have to call it off of Bronek. But that's no big deal because again, it adds to our grade 1s in the drop zone. But at the same time, the main reason why Bronek's so good, and especially as the first G Guard, is that the number of grade 1s that we have that are 10k shield value are numerous in this build. So that means Bronek can be G Guarding for 25k, even as much as 35k shield on that very first G Guard, which means that against your opponent's first stride, you have pretty good measures for defense from the get-go. And that's why Plotmaker, again, is being cut down by 1, because we need to make space for the new one that is a lot better, in my opinion, Deepgriever. But again, Plotmaker as a vanilla 25k shield is still pretty solid because that Ritual 3 is pretty easy to fulfill, especially in this deck. And then, of course, Gillingr allows you to make use of your grade 1s on the field to get up to like a 35k shield or so if you have 2 grade 1s with 10k shield on the field. And you also flip a G Guard, which is usually going to be Bronek if you didn't use it, or it's going to be Plotmaker if you didn't use that. And then, of course, if you move 2 grade 1s, then you draw a card, which is amazing because it gets you back that card advantage that you had to sacrifice in order to go to the G Guardian in the first place because you had to discard the heal trigger. So Gillingr is still good. And then I need not explain why Deepgriever is such a good G Guardian. Deepgriever is a PG from our G Zone, so against several decks that have nasty guard restricts such as DI, such as Angel Feather, the list goes on, we need this card in our G Zone to be able to go into when we have some counterblast available and we have a heal trigger in hand. We're able to make use of the grade 1s we have in our drop zone to get an effective PG. Now notice that oftentimes you don't even need the PG effect because 4 grade 1s is plenty. This gets +5 shield for each grade 1 you put back in the deck. So 4 grade 1s is plenty. That makes this a 35k shield anyway. But getting a PG just gives you more comfort because sometimes OT can ruin your dreams. But all the same, this card also recovers grade 1s back to your deck, which means that Charon's can get back in the deck. That means Illdona's can go back to the deck. That means whatever you need can go back to the deck, which allows you to recover your engine and further, grind out your opponent if it comes to that. Go into your additional Morfessas, all of that. So Deepgriever's all of that in one card. It's such a good G Guardian. Definitely one of the best G Guardians in the set. But yeah, guys, that's gonna do it for the deck profile. I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation of my eating my own words with this abominable Morfessa turbo build. Now, I do think that this deck has potential in this current meta. However, I will say that the V version of Luard is probably going to be a lot better going into this meta just because it's so fast. It can accomplish all that it needs to do from the get-go on the first grade 3 turn. And damage denying is really difficult to do against it because all it needs is 1 counterblast for it to get all of its plays going. The fact that you can, make use of the Karns to recover that as you need, and of course play down the Heal Guardian if the damage value to 0 means that Luard is going to be super oppressive in this meta, in my opinion, compared to this build. But this build has the advantages of the earlier tempo Luard build that I presented in April, that it can still control the field relatively better than what Luard can do, the Luard can do rather, and the fact that it allows you to play a more grindy game if necessary because of the big hand sizes in comparison. So the fact that this deck has those advantages is really nice. It's going to help us out this meta, but of course we're not able to stack force markers like Luard can, like 3 force markers, specifically 3 force 1 markers every single turn. It's pretty insane. I'm going to be quite honest about that. And the fact that, you know, Chain Rancor also exists means that that deck's going to basically do some damage this meta. But I do like this build for me, like as my personal preference. I hope you guys do too. If you did, please feel free to leave a like and a comment, and please subscribe as well for more Vanguard content. I know I've been relatively quiet on videos lately, but please bear with me. I'll have a lot more videos in the near future, but if you look forward to that, please do leave a like and a comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next videos. Thanks for watching.